So the second round of the Supercars Championship wrapped up yesterday in Albert Park. The first time that Albert Park has been a championship round. It was a pretty good weekend overall. Some solid races with one outstanding one on the Saturday evening, which I'll get more into. So yeah, here's the rundown of what happened at Albert Park for Supercars. So I'll actually start off with the qualifying format, and it's fair to say that actually didn't work too well because with the shorter 10-minute sessions and the sheer length of the lap at Albert Park for the Supercars, it meant that most of the teams and drivers only got one lap each, which we're not really used to seeing in qualifying. We're used to seeing one lap early on in the session and then another one towards the end, which is usually the very exciting bit of qualifying, and that just didn't happen this time around, which was unfortunate. But heading into the first race, it was Scott McLaughlin and Fabian Coulthard on the front row. Good to see Fabian back up there, considering where he was at Adelaide, which was a disastrous weekend for him. And after the first corner, it was McLaughlin leading from Whincup jumping Coulthard off the line. And what followed was a pretty boring sort of race. The only major sort of thing accident that happened was between Simona Di Silvestro and Jack Le Brocq, where Simona just bowled him off the track at the end of on the second to last corner, I think it was. Just braked too late and took him out, took both cars out of the race. But what we did get was probably the overtake of the year so far, which was Scott McLaughlin on Jamie Whincup for the lead. Jamie Whincup performed the undercut on Scott McLaughlin, so he came in the pits first and got the benefit of fresher tyres. And what resulted was a fantastic pass by McLaughlin around the outside of turn 4. It was quite good to watch. So yeah, Scott McLaughlin won that race from Jamie Whincup and Fabian Coulthard, with Van Gisbergen, who was pretty off the pace all weekend, in 4th place, followed by Chaz Mostert. So next up was a race on Saturday morning, which turned out to be a wet race. It was a shorter race, 13 laps as opposed to the 25 of the first race, meaning no pit stops, which those who have been watching Supercars for a few years know that those sort of races don't generally result in the most exciting races, and that was still the case here. It was exciting to watch, as always, all the drivers fighting the cars in the wet conditions. I think the highlight of this particular race was a battle between Shane Van Gisbergen and Cam Waters for 4th place. It was just great driving by the both of them. As we know, Shane Van Gisbergen is probably the best guy out there in terms of car control, which makes him generally the best in the wet conditions, probably along with Mostert, who was also very good, and he had a few sideways moments coming out of turn 12, the fast left-right kink section. Pretty solid race overall, nothing particularly amazing. Jamie Whincup led from the front, never really threatened by Scott McLaughlin and Fabian Coulthard behind. So the same podium as the first race, but now we can get into the very exciting bit of the weekend, which was the third race. Now, the third race on Saturday night after the F1 qualifying, this was probably one of the better races in the last couple years, at least. It was just fantastic to watch. So Scott McLaughlin was on pole position from Nick Percat, Scott Pye and Jamie Whincup, and off the line, Percat didn't get the best one, and Whincup went across the grass and into the pit lane exit just to take P2 off, who ended up being P3 off Percat. And as the commentary said at the time, it really shows that despite how much Whincup has already achieved, he wants these results and he still wants to win, and it is quite fantastic to watch. So Scott McLaughlin led the early stages from Scott Pye and Jamie Whincup until I think it was only the second or third lap. Scott McLaughlin made quite a costly error. He locked up going into turn 1 and went straight across the grass and the gravel and came back onto the track in about 7th place, which gave Scott Pye the lead. Now, I think a lot of us probably thought that with Jamie Whincup behind him that Scott Pye would probably lead for a couple laps but eventually succumb to the pressure of Jamie Whincup. But he did a superb job, it has to be said. He had actually superior pace to Whincup, which was quite surprising, and in the dry conditions, he was very much pulling away. But then, of course, the weather hit, and this is when it got particularly exciting because in the early stages, about before lap 10, it was very interesting to see the teams deciding whether to stick it out and wait for the wet conditions, and as it turns out, they didn't, with Chaz Mostert being the first to come in from about 6th place. Percat in 4th was holding about 6 or 7 cars behind him up, so Tickford pulled Chaz Mostert out of that pack, and he came out of the pits eventually in 3rd, so that strategy worked out well for them. But so yeah, everyone came in and pretty much held position, but then the rain started coming down. So it was about lap 18 or 19 that it started raining, and this left the teams with a very, very interesting predicament. Do they come in for wets and hope that it stays wet and that allows the wet tyre to gain back the 50 or so seconds lost through the transit of the pit lane? Or did they stay out, cross their fingers and hope that the dry tyre could make it the final 5 or 6 laps? And as it turns out, staying on the dries was the correct call. The leading driver to come in off the dry tyre and onto the wet was Chaz Mostert, followed by a lot of championship contenders actually, involving Scott McLaughlin, David Reynolds and Shane Van Gisbergen, and they all came in and put the wet weather tyres on. Those that stayed out, however, was Scott Pye, Jamie Whincup and Nick Percat. So Scott Pye had a pretty comfortable margin over Jamie Whincup of about 3 or 4 seconds up until I think it was the 3rd to last lap, heading into the penultimate lap. Scott Pye, fighting for his first Supercars win, locked up the rears heading into turn 13, an easy mistake to make in the wet. And as a result, Jamie Whincup and Nick Percat were right behind him heading into the last 2 laps of the race. And watching these guys battle it out on dry tyres in appalling conditions, in dying light, was some of the best racing we have seen in the last few years. And Scott Pye was just able to hold off the 7-time champion and claim his first win in Supercars and Walkinshaw Andretti United's first win since Holden withdrew their racing team sponsorship from them. And this was pretty special to witness, with Zach Brown, the boss of McLaren, and the United part of Walkinshaw Andretti United present. But mainly, it was great to see Scott Pye finally get what he deserved in this championship. He's had some of the worst luck and is one of the most underrated drivers currently in the field. He spent a year or 2 at LDM and then Dick Johnson, where he was just at the back of the pack. He had a couple of major crashes in his first year with LDM. They're worth YouTubing because they're nuts. And then he actually, I think a lot of people forget that he built up Team Penske. He was their main driver after Marcus Ambrose stepped back in their first year of competition. And he helped build that team to the force they are today. There is no denying that he's a major part of their current success. So to see him finally get a win was very satisfying to see. And I think all fans, no matter Ford, Holden or Nissan, were happy to see him win. And unfortunately, in comparison to the amazing race 3, the 4th and final race of the weekend was pretty uneventful, with Jamie Whincup and David Reynolds starting off the front row. David Reynolds putting the criticism from Adelaide about his perhaps lack of self-belief behind him to get the better start and take Jamie Whincup into turn 1. He compromised Whincup's line, and so Nick Percat got through into 2nd as well. Fantastic weekend for Percat and for BJR in general. They really also deserved some good results after the horrible year that they had last year and the pretty bad run they had at Adelaide as well. So, and that was pretty much it. David Reynolds led the field. There was a safety car on about lap 9 for James Golding, whose car caught fire, and then that meant the race was time certain anyway, and they only got 1 lap after safety car. So, unfortunately, a rather disappointing end to the weekend, but still not a bad weekend of racing overall. So that's been my quick wrap-up of the Supercars Melbourne 400. I hope you've enjoyed. If you have, do leave a like. I will be also making a video on the F1 race, hopefully in the next few days, as that's definitely worth talking about. So yeah, catch you later.